When HOA President Margaret forced my pregnant sister to strip in her own bathroom, she made one fatal mistake: she didn't know who I was. As a Supreme Court justice, I've toppled corrupt systems before. Now I'll destroy hers brick by brick until justice is served. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across my driveway as I pulled up to my childhood home, the place where my sister Emma now lived with her husband. I hadn't told her I was coming. I wanted to surprise her, to see her face light up the way it used to when we were kids. But the moment I stepped out of my car, I knew something was terribly wrong. Emma sat on the front steps, her pregnant belly round and full at 8 months. She was crying. Not the quiet, dignified tears of someone watching a sad movie, but the gut-wrenching sobs of a woman whose spirit had been broken. Her hands trembled as she wiped her face, and even from a distance, I could see the red marks on her wrists. My heart stopped. "Emma?" I ran to her, my briefcase falling forgotten on the pavement. "What happened? Are you hurt? Is the baby okay?" She looked up at me, and the devastation in her eyes made my blood run cold. My little sister, who had always been the sunshine of our family, looked like a shell of herself. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice cracking. I can't stay here anymore. I can't live like this." I knelt beside her, ignoring the expensive fabric of my suit pressing against the concrete. "Tell me everything. Right now." Emma had been bringing groceries from her car when Margaret Patterson appeared. Margaret was the HOA president, a woman in her late 50s who wore her authority like a crown. She had moved into the neighborhood 3 years ago and had made it her mission to enforce every rule, no matter how minor, with ruthless efficiency. "Mrs. Coleman," Margaret's voice had been sharp, cutting through the peaceful afternoon. "I need to speak with you immediately." Emma had turned, bags in hand, exhausted from her doctor's appointment. "Hello, Mrs. Patterson. Can this wait? I really need to get these groceries inside and rest." "No, it cannot wait." Margaret had marched up to her, clipboard in hand, flanked by 2 other HOA board members Emma didn't recognize. "There have been complaints about your garden gnomes violating the community aesthetic guidelines. Section 7, paragraph 12 clearly states that lawn decorations must be pre-approved." Emma had blinked in confusion. "But those gnomes have been there for 2 years. My grandmother gave them to me before she passed. No one ever said anything before." "Well, someone is saying something now," Margaret had snapped. "They need to be removed immediately, or you'll face a fine of $200 per day." Emma had felt tears prick her eyes, but she'd nodded. "Okay, I'll remove them tomorrow. I'm just really tired today and my back hurts." "Tomorrow isn't good enough." Margaret had stepped closer, her eyes cold. "I want them gone within the hour." "Mrs. Patterson, please. I'm 8 months pregnant. My husband is at work. Can't this just wait until?" "Rules are rules, Mrs. Coleman." Margaret had glanced at the other board members, and something unspoken had passed between them. "However, there's another matter we need to discuss. We've received reports of suspicious activity at your residence." Emma's heart had begun to race. "Suspicious activity? What are you talking about?" "Frequent visitors at odd hours. Packages delivered that seem unusually heavy. A neighbor reported seeing you accept a large envelope from an unknown individual last week." Margaret had crossed her arms. "The HOA board has reason to believe you may be involved in illegal activities." "What? That's insane. I'm pregnant. I'm home all day. The suspicious packages are baby supplies, and the envelope was from my sister who's a—" "We need to search your property," Margaret had interrupted. "Absolutely not. You have no right." Section 15, paragraph 8 of the HOA agreement gives the board the right to inspect any property if there's reasonable suspicion of illegal activity. Margaret had pulled out her phone. "We can do this the easy way, or I can call the police and tell them you're being uncooperative about a drug investigation." Emma had felt the world tilt. "Drug investigation? This is crazy. I don't do drugs. I'm pregnant." "Then you have nothing to hide," Margaret had said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Let us in, let us look around, and if everything is as you say, we'll be out of your hair in 15 minutes. Trapped and terrified, Emma had let them in. What happened next would haunt Emma for months. They had torn through her home like locusts. They dumped out drawers, rifled through cabinets, pulled books from shelves. Margaret had been particularly interested in the nursery, pulling apart the carefully organized baby clothes, examining every gift with suspicious eyes. "This crib seems expensive," Margaret had noted. "How exactly did you afford this?" "It was a gift from my sister," Emma had said, her voice shaking. Your mysterious sister who sends you envelopes. Margaret had smiled. How convenient. They'd moved to the bedroom next. Emma had stood in the doorway, hugging herself, feeling violated as these strangers touched her intimate belongings. They'd gone through her jewelry box, her closet, even her underwear drawer. Finally, Margaret had found Emma's medication bottles on the bathroom counter. And what are these? She demanded. Prenatal vitamins and iron supplements, Emma had said. You can see the labels? These could be anything. Margaret had pocketed them. We'll need to have these tested. Those are prescribed by my doctor. I need those. You'll get them back if they're legitimate. Margaret had turned to her with cold eyes. But there's one more thing we need to do to ensure this community's safety. What else could you possibly need? I need you to lift your shirt. Emma had frozen. Excuse me? If you're not hiding drugs, you won't mind proving it. Margaret had gestured to the other women. We need to do a visual inspection to ensure you're not concealing anything on your person. Are you insane? Emma's voice had risen. You want to strip search me? In my own home? While I'm pregnant? Not a full strip search. Just lift your shirt and roll down your pants a bit. If you refuse, it only makes you look more guilty. I'm 8 months pregnant. Where exactly do you think I'm hiding drugs? People hide things in all sorts of places, Margaret had said, her tone suggesting something even more invasive. Now, are you going to cooperate, or do I need to make that phone call to the police? Emma had stood there, shaking, tears streaming down her face. She'd thought about her baby, about the stress on her body, about the humiliation. But she'd also thought about the police being called, about the scene it would cause, about the possibility of being arrested and taken away from her home. With trembling hands, she'd lifted her shirt. Margaret had stepped forward, examining Emma's pregnant belly with cold, clinical eyes. Turn around, she'd commanded. Emma had complied, feeling something inside her break as she stood there, exposed and degraded in her own bathroom while 3 women who were supposed to be her neighbors treated her like a criminal. Roll down your pants, Margaret had ordered next. Please, Emma had whispered. Please don't make me do this. Roll them down or I make the call. Emma had hooked her thumbs in her waistband, pulling her pants down slightly to show her hips and lower back. She'd never felt more humiliated in her entire life. After what felt like an eternity, Margaret had finally stepped back. Fine. You're clear. But we're taking the medications and the gnomes. And I'll be watching you, Mrs. Coleman. One wrong move, and I'll have you out of this neighborhood so fast your head will spin. They'd left her there, standing in her bathroom, crying so hard she could barely breathe. As Emma finished telling me this story, I sat on those steps feeling a rage I hadn't experienced since my first year as a prosecutor, when I'd seen a young woman brutalized by someone who'd thought they had power over her. But this was different. This was my baby sister. They took your medications? My voice was deadly calm. Emma nodded, wiping her eyes. My prenatal vitamins. My iron supplements. The doctor said my iron is already low. I need those, Sarah. I stood up, pulling out my phone. What you're describing is illegal search and seizure, assault, coercion, theft of medical necessities, and possibly false imprisonment. Did anyone else see this happen? My neighbor, Mrs. Chin. She came over after they left. She saw me on the steps crying and I told her everything. She was horrified. Good. I need you to write down everything that happened with times and exact words if you can remember them. Every single detail. I scrolled through my contacts. Then I need you to pack a bag. You're staying with me until this is resolved. Sarah, what are you going to do? I looked down at my little sister, at the woman who used to dance in our kitchen and sing made-up songs, who'd held my hand at our mother's funeral and told me everything would be okay. The woman who was supposed to be glowing with the joy of her first child, not traumatized in her own home. I'm going to do what I should have done years ago when you first told me about this HOA, I said quietly. I'm going to remind some people that power without accountability is tyranny. And tyranny has no place in America. I didn't tell Emma who I really was. She knew I was a lawyer, knew I worked in the court system, but we'd always been private about the details of my career. Most people knew me as Sarah Mitchell, the woman who'd moved away for work. They didn't know I was the Honorable Sarah Mitchell, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, appointed 3 years ago after 2 decades building cases that had reshaped privacy law in America. The next morning I made some calls. Within hours I had Mrs. Chen's detailed statement. I had photographs of Emma's ransacked home, which Emma had taken on her phone after Margaret left. I had the HOA bylaws which I'd obtained from the county recorder's office. And I had a very interesting conversation with Emma's doctor, who was apoplectic about the medication theft. Those supplements are essential, Dr. Reynolds had told me. Emma's pregnancy is already high risk because of her age and blood pressure. Taking away her iron could cause serious complications. This is medical neglect, possibly endangering the life of her and her unborn child. I thanked her and added her statement to my growing file. Then I paid a visit to the local police department. I need to report a crime, I told the desk sergeant. He'd looked up at me, probably seeing just another woman with a complaint. What kind of crime, ma'am? Multiple felonies, actually. Illegal search and seizure, assault, coercion under threat of false police report, theft of medical necessities from a pregnant woman, and reckless endangerment. I placed my folder on the desk. I have witness statements, photographic evidence, and medical documentation. I'd like to file a formal complaint and have the perpetrators arrested. The sergeant had flipped through the folder, his expression growing more serious with each page. Ma'am, this is... Who exactly are you? I'd handed him my card. His eyes had widened. Justice Mitchell. Yes, ma'am. I'll get a detective on this immediately. Margaret Patterson had no idea what was coming. 2 days later, 2 detectives appeared at her door with a warrant. They arrested her for multiple felonies, handcuffing her right there on her perfectly manicured lawn while her neighbors watched. They arrested the 2 board members who'd participated in the search. They seized HOA records, computers, and Margaret's personal files. What they found was damning. Margaret had been running the HOA like her personal fiefdom for years. She'd been collecting illegal fines, pocketing HOA dues, and selectively enforcing rules against people she didn't like while ignoring violations by her friends. She'd been targeting Emma specifically because Emma had filed a complaint about Margaret's dog attacking a child at the neighborhood park. Margaret had used her position to retaliate, making Emma's life miserable for months before escalating to the search. But the evidence went deeper. They found records of Margaret forcing her way into other homes, conducting inspections that violated multiple laws. They found messages where she'd bragged about making residents cry, about her power to ruin people's lives. They found evidence that she'd falsified complaints to justify her actions. The district attorney called me personally. Justice Mitchell, this case is bigger than we thought. Patterson has been systematically abusing her authority for years. We're looking at multiple victims, racketeering charges, organized harassment. This woman is going away for a long time. Good, I'd said. But I want something else too. I'd requested a meeting with the HOA board's emergency session, called to address the scandal of Margaret's arrest. When I walked into that community center, every resident in the neighborhood seemed to be there. Emma sat in the front row, her hand in her husband's, who'd flown home early from his business trip. The remaining board members sat at a table looking nervous. They'd probably expected angry homeowners. They hadn't expected me. Good evening, I'd said, standing before them. My name is Sarah Mitchell. Some of you may know me as Emma Coleman's sister. Others may know me by my professional title, Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. The room had gone silent. Absolutely silent. I'm here tonight not as a justice but as a sister. A sister whose pregnant sibling was terrorized, violated, and abused in her own home by people who believed they had the authority to act as judge, jury, and executioner over their neighbors. I'd walked slowly along the front of the room, making eye contact with each board member. Let me tell you what Margaret Patterson did to my sister. She forced her way into Emma's home under threat of false police reports. She ransacked Emma's belongings. She stole medically necessary supplements from a high-risk pregnancy. And then she forced my pregnant sister to partially disrobe in her own bathroom, supposedly to search for drugs that never existed. Gasps echoed through the room. Several people turned to look at Emma, who sat with tears streaming down her face. This wasn't an inspection. This wasn't following rules. This was assault. This was a violation of the Fourth Amendment, which protects every American from unlawful search and seizure. This was an abuse of power so egregious that it resulted in multiple felony charges. I turned to the board members. But Margaret Patterson didn't act in a vacuum. She acted with the implicit and sometimes explicit approval of an HOA structure that placed no checks on her authority. She acted in a community where people were more afraid of fines than they were empowered to stand up for their rights. One board member, a younger man named David, had raised his hand tentatively. Justice Mitchell, we didn't know the extent of what Margaret was doing. We thought. You thought what? That it was okay to let one person have unchecked power over an entire community? That rules mattered more than basic human dignity? I'd shaken my head. Ignorance is not an excuse. Every person in this room who stayed silent while Margaret terrorized their neighbors bears responsibility. I pulled out a stack of documents. I have in my hand 23 written complaints from residents of this neighborhood. 23 people who were too afraid to speak up while Margaret was in charge. They detail harassment, illegal fines, property damage, and in 3 cases unlawful entry into homes. 3 cases just like Emma's. The room had erupted in shocked conversation. "So here's what's going to happen," I'd said, my voice cutting through the noise. "This HOA is going to dissolve immediately. You're going to hold a vote tonight to disband it entirely and form a new association with proper legal oversight, term limits, and transparent accounting. You're going to refund every illegal fine Margaret Patterson collected. And you're going to publicly apologize to every resident she victimized." Justice Mitchell, another board member, had stammered, "We can't just dissolve the HOA. There are legal procedures. I've already consulted with 3 HOA attorneys. The residents have every legal right to dissolve and reform. You can do this the easy way tonight, or I can make sure every major news outlet in the country hears about how an HOA enabled the assault of a pregnant woman." I'd leaned forward. "What's it going to be?" They'd voted to dissolve within 15 minutes. 3 months later, I held my nephew in my arms for the first time. Emma had given birth to a healthy baby boy whom she'd named Oliver. As I looked down at his tiny face, I thought about how close we'd come to losing him, how the stress Emma had endured could have ended tragically. Margaret Patterson had pleaded guilty to multiple felonies. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution to her victims. The 2 board members who'd participated in Emma's search received probation and community service. But more importantly, the neighborhood had changed. The new association had real oversight, elected leadership that rotated annually, and clear policies that protected residents' rights. Emma's story had spread, leading to investigations of abusive HOAs in 3 other counties. Laws were being proposed to regulate HOA authority and protect homeowners. "Thank you," Emma whispered, sitting beside me in her living room. The garden gnomes from our grandmother sat proudly on the front lawn, visible through the window. "Thank you for believing me. Thank you for fighting for me. You're my sister," I said simply. "I would fight anyone anywhere for you." "I was so scared that day," she admitted. "I felt so powerless, so small. Like I didn't matter." "You matter," I told her fiercely. "You matter more than any rule, any fine, any power-hungry person who thinks authority gives them the right to hurt others. And you taught Oliver something important today." "What's that?" "That standing up to bullies isn't just right, it's necessary. That silence enables abuse. And that family means never having to face cruelty alone." Emma squeezed my hand, and I saw in her eyes the little girl who'd once believed her big sister could fix anything. The difference now was that she knew the truth. I couldn't fix everything. But I could fight. I could use my voice, my position, my knowledge of law to ensure that justice wasn't just an abstract concept but a living, breathing force that protected the vulnerable. Margaret Patterson had looked at my sister and seen someone weak, someone she could intimidate and control. She'd been wrong. Emma wasn't weak. She'd just been alone until she wasn't. As Oliver made a small sound in his sleep, I made him a silent promise. I promised that I would do everything in my power to build a world where people like Margaret Patterson faced consequences, where abuse of power was met with accountability, where no one had to feel as small and helpless as Emma had felt on those bathroom tiles. The law is a weapon for the powerful or a shield for the vulnerable. The choice of which it becomes belongs to those of us who wield it. I chose to make it a shield. And I would never stop choosing that for as long as I had breath in my body and the power to make a difference. Because that's what family does. That's what justice means. And that's what love demands. Sometimes the most powerful courtrooms aren't in marble buildings with towering columns. Sometimes they're in community centers, in living rooms, in the moment when someone finally says, enough. Real justice isn't always about precedent and procedure. It's about looking at someone who's been hurt and saying, I believe you. I stand with you. And together we will make this right. That's the justice system I believe in. That's the world I fight to create. And on that day in my sister's home, holding my nephew and watching Emma smile for the first time in months, I knew that sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys really do win.